Hi, Dennis Weiss. Welcome to Why Like Ike, and we're here with the Deputy Director, Tim Reeves, who we love to talk about Eisenhower Reeves,
We do.
right?
We do.
Yes, we do. So what are we going to talk about today?
Well, we're going to talk about a big anniversary coming up here in a couple of weeks, the 55th anniversary of Eisenhower's famous farewell address, which I think people are probably more familiar with that address and a certain phrase that we'll talk about perhaps than they are even of President Eisenhower. And then also just the 55 years since he left office, some of the things he accomplished during that time.
You know, I wished I agreed with you, because it would make this a lot easier just to move right through. But I think fewer and fewer and fewer people all the time are familiar with this speech, and probably one of the most important speeches ever given by a president. Formed a vision of from when he left office to where we sit today.
Yeah.
And I really think it's people like you and me that are familiar with this speech.
Well, I think what I meant was that phrase, military-industrial complex.
Yeah.
You can hear in the news almost weekly.
That's right.
And I think people refer to it who probably don't even know its origin.
I would agree.
In Eisenhower's farewell address.
I would agree, and that we agree on. I think so few people have a understanding of the complete text, of which I have here carefully printed on paper that I can touch. And right there it is in its original teleprompter roller format that came out of a box that you have a picture of.
That's right. In fact, Ike used not only the teleprompter, but also a reading copy on his desk because he didn't trust the teleprompter to be as prompt, perhaps, as it should
paper
be.
with little holes and little wheels that turn. That's pretty complicated.
Yeah, I don't know if they use those anymore, but at least not that version.
Yeah, not that version. Okay, so let's talk about this speech. Dwight David Eisenhower was leaving 8 years of peace and prosperity behind.
That's right, and towards the end of his administration, well, actually a couple of years before he left, in 1959, he remarked to a staff member that he'd like to put some kind of remarks together to give an address to Congress, the American people, as a farewell address, as his hero George Washington did. And in fact, Washington's is probably the most famous farewell address, where he talks about avoiding entangling alliances and that sort of thing. But Eisenhower's clearly must be the second most famous farewell address. And it's interesting, too, that it's coupled, given the same week of John F. Kennedy's famous inaugural address. So here you had these two landmark presidential addresses in 20th century American history, given within just 3 days of each other, which I think most of us don't realize.
I didn't realize that. That's very interesting.
And interesting also just because of the contrast in their visions. You have Eisenhower really expressing a sense of limits to what a nation can do, and Kennedy really saying just the opposite, that there's really no barriers to what we can do. So given the men's age difference and those visions, there really is a pretty stark contrast between those two speeches.
Interesting comment. I appreciate hearing you say that. I quickly, before the camera came on, read the text of the speech again, and I've read it more than once before. But here's what struck me this time as I read through it, and sitting in this room in the presidential library surrounded by artifacts. Ike had lived, so 8 years of peace and prosperity preceded by what? A century of 4 major wars.
And depression.
But as a military man, Mr. Eisenhower had the benefit of wisdom from the horrors of war. And as I read it again this morning, I hear that in his speech. He's telling us war is an awful thing and doesn't solve many problems. Being strong and defending yourself does, but it's to avoid war. Only a soldier knows, I think,
as he said,
the cost of war.
Oh, and also he is, of course, lamenting the rise of this military-industrial complex. As he says, for the first time in our history, we have a peacetime armaments industry. But he says it's an imperative. We can't do away with it. We have to accept it, but we also have to make sure that it doesn't dominate society.
It doesn't guide society.
That's right.
He was fearful of it going even from dominance to being a guiding force for our decisions, and he was very fearful of that.
That's right. It was the first fear that he warned of in the speech. And the second was the rise of this scientific and technological elite
Right.
that was dominating research because of the demands of the military-industrial complex. And he said, think of all these inventions that scientists and
Right.
innovators aren't getting to because they're all working on government contracts on defense-related projects. And so he saw it as just a huge, systemic problem. And what I find interesting, just in terms of Eisenhower history in general, is how the real theme of the speech, which is balance, goes back to the 1940s when he
Right.
first started talking about the role of government. And I know we've discussed before Ike's middle way and how he thought you had to avoid concentrations of, private power, economic power on one side of the road, and unlimited state power on the other, to strike that balance right down the center. And he talks about that in the speech as well. In fact, we had one of our speakers in our recent Ike 125 series, Yannick Mishkowski, pointed out that how Eisenhower only evokes the military-industrial complex once in that speech, but balance 9 times. And most of the speech, again, is about maintaining that balance, balancing power, balancing priorities. And so it's quintessential, Dwight Eisenhower.
Yeah, a very wise man, a great leader, and I found that interesting as I speed read again this morning. Balance just jumps out. Balance is a great thing in anything in life, whether it's in your diet or in your the lady standing there with the Emmy that was. I guess it wasn't an actual Emmy, but a
honorary Emmy
for
1956.
contribution to television broadcasting. But she stands there in balance, holding up her piece of the world.
Yeah, it's a good symbol.
So as we all stand in whatever or do whatever, balance is the key to success, and overbalance is the key to falling.
Well, Eisenhower certainly believed that.
Yeah, I saw this, and I'm going to read it so we can talk about it. Paragraph heading 5 there. Another factor in maintaining balance involves the element of time. As we peer into society's future, we, you and I, and our government must avoid the impulse to live only for today. Plundering for our own ease and convenience suppresses resources of tomorrow. We cannot mortgage the material assets of our grandchildren without risking the loss also of their political and spiritual heritage. We want democracy to survive for all generations to come, not to become the insolvent phantom of tomorrow. It's a pretty strong linkage of the failure to maintain balance to perils of the future.
There is, specifically debt, as I would see it, government debt being a threat to the future of his grandchildren. And again, there's that sense of limits. We can't expend all the resources of today just for our own benefit.
Right.
We have to make sure they're here for future generations. And so again, that's something that's so marvelous about the farewell address, is it expresses so much of Eisenhower's beliefs.
Yeah.
And we have, of this famous address, we now have 29 drafts. Eisenhower had a really interesting process for developing a speech. He'd give a broad idea to his speechwriters. They'd come back with ideas, and they'd kind of kick it back and forth. But they said that he would rewrite it so extensively that by the end it was all Eisenhower, that he'd spent more time on it than his speechwriters. And so my point is, the farewell address really is Dwight Eisenhower's last testament as a public figure, as it were.
When Secretary Robert Gates came here and gave a speech on the front steps, I don't remember what month and year that was. I was thinking, when was it when you were talking about the 3 days in between those major speeches? But as Secretary Gates was readying to leave office, he came here to give his farewell address.
That's
the
right.
way I viewed it and heard it, and it was also a very powerful speech, and it mirrored the comments from Dwight David Eisenhower.
It was intentional on
Very
his part.
It resonated well from the man who was leading the defensive efforts of our country at the time. That's
Another Kansan.
Another Kansan, that's right. What a testament to the state we live in, where Eisenhower has chose to let his library be built and the records stored for history. But what a wonderful thing it is for you and I to sit here and read this, but we're not the only ones that can come here and read a copy of the speech or see these things. Anybody behind the lens can too, Tim.
They can.
Yeah. All right, so you have some documents over on the side that you told me before the camera came on were really some examples of how Eisenhower built his speech.
Well, we do. The first is a memo from May 20th, 1959. and it's from, the initials are MM. That was Malcolm Moose, who was an academic who worked as a
Okay.
special assistant to Eisenhower as a speechwriter.
Okay.
And says that the president mentioned in an aside this morning when I brought up the topic of selective major addresses for the remainder of his term, that he had one speech he would very much like to make. And so here it is, May of 1959, and Ike's
Right.
already thinking about the farewell address. And then there are subsequent memos as they're updating these thoughts. Here's one from the next April 5th, 1960, again from Malcolm Moose, saying, I recommend that we reread the farewell address of George Washington for
Yeah.
ideas. So
Yeah.
clearly, that was part of the model. There are also a number of myths attached to the farewell address.
Okay, I'm
And-
not familiar with that.
Well, and you'll still hear some of them on the Sunday talk shows.
Well, we hear a lot of
And-
myths
yeah.
on the Sunday talk shows.
But they'll say, Eisenhower meant to, originally Ike wanted to talk about the military-industrial congressional complex. That was never in the speech. Military-industrial scientific complex was, because again, he was afraid of
Right.
this need of the defense industry taking over all scientific research.
You said that a while ago, and I just rushed right past it. Let's pause. I want your point of view. So I read the speech, read that, listened to you say that, and again, we have Dwight David Eisenhower being consistent, saying military-industrial complex represented some threat, but this is very specific. He said, this is, if we focus on this, it will pull resources, talent and resources away from other research. So what's other research?
Well, he's saying those scientists and engineers could be working on, say, non-defense related projects,
Right.
maybe, medical technology. But
This
he-
was
but of course he says,
1961.
yes, but he says, of course, we'll never know what might have been invented had they
Right.
not been preoccupied
Very
with getting
true.
government contracts and
Yeah.
doing defense research.
Mhm.
And again, he says the military-industrial complex is imperative because of this age we live in now, when we can be destroyed by our enemies literally within hours.
Right.
We don't have time to start defense industry from scratch in
Mhm.
preparation for war. We had that luxury in the past. We no longer have it, so we're saddled with this military-industrial complex. But let's not let it dominate society.
As you think about the thought process of someone who's a creator, an inventor, it makes a difference whether you actually discover Play-Doh while you're working on a NASA program, or whether you're focusing on finding a way of creating an artificial heart so a human being could live
Right.
until a transplant could be made. The difference in outcome there is not only with what is done, but the length of time that it takes to do it. If we don't have people focusing on our best and brightest focusing on non-military research, we will have less beneficial things to the rest of life. I think
That's his point.
that's his point,
Yeah.
right?
And of course, there are other benefits. For example, the internet, which grew out of
Sure.
the defense-related industry, and of course with NASA, Tang and space food sticks.
That's
So,
right.
there you
I
go.
really liked Tang that much, but it was okay.
And then there's one other myth. There was a famous editor of the Saturday Evening Post, or maybe it was Saturday Review, named Norman Cousins.
Okay.
And sometimes he's given credit for, inspiring Ike to get this farewell address. There are memos from the White House saying, Norman Cousins called. His suggestion that you give a farewell address to the country a few days before the 20th on television from your office, etc. And then someone replies to the president. The president seemed to think he would like to do this, but the idea of trying to get anyone like Norman Cousins working on it would be dreadful.
That's classic.
And so he kind of
Read
shot
the
that.
date. I just
Um,
noticed it says 1960.
This-
The first one you read was in a memo of
Right,
1959.
so they were a year and a half ahead of Norman Cousins.
Yeah,
But Cousins
exactly.
has often taken credit for the farewell address,
Yeah.
and many historians have followed suit, and in their
Sure.
biographies of Eisenhower giving
Well,
Cousins some
research
credit.
that's done fast and easy is a lot easier to get on the news than it
That's
is
right,
done
yeah.
well and
Yeah, you have to do some digging
thoroughly.
to get to the good
But
stuff.
they can come here and
And
get the facts.
That's what the best ones
Yeah.
do.
Okay.
I mentioned also we have 29 drafts of that speech, and have just an example here of one that's been amended by somebody. But what's interesting,
Yeah.
until 2010, we had, I think maybe 16 or 15 or 16 drafts. But then
Oh, really?
the descendants of Malcolm Moose, one of those speech writers, were I think, selling a cabin that their family owned in Minnesota. They found 8 boxes of their father's old papers.
Wow.
And lo and behold, several files on the farewell address that scholars had never had access to before.
You mentioned that in some program we did a couple of years ago, that sometimes history preservation is quite accidental. It's going through
it is.
cousin
Yeah.
so-and-so's attic, and then things come here. I guess all of that, it's interesting to think about, and I think people go up and look in your own attic, you know, but here's the cool thing to me. They couldn't go anywhere if here wasn't here.
That's right.
The
What
Dwight
would happen to
David
it?
Eisenhower Presidential Library and Museum were not established here to hold these things and have archivists and researchers that can glean the information from what is kept and preserved here, are vital to the correct keeping of history.
It really is, and nice, of course, to have it all in one place for someone who's studying the Eisenhower years. And just last week, I received material from a former administration official who's now in his mid-90s, of course. And these are the records of a truth squad that would follow the Adlai Stevenson campaign in 1956, you know, rebutting
Sure.
everything the candidate had just said at that stop. But again, it's material that scholars have never had access to before, and it's been in someone's attic, and now it's coming to Abilene.
We were shooting here one time. I think we were shooting with Carl Weisenbach, a program in his office, and you were standing in the back, and a call came in from the White House, and you had to go get some stuff that they needed and send it off. And I remember Carl saying, we're getting a lot of calls from the White House right now. Responding to requests for information.
That does
I don't
happen.
think people think about that a lot. They think of history.
And that it still has this
Cool.
contemporary relevance to
Yeah.
the current occupant of the White House. It
Yeah.
does, and it is
Yeah.
amazing how often we get those types of requests.
Yeah. Okay. You know, as we this is one of my favorites. I'm so glad that you suggested we do this. I love the Eisenhower presidential farewell address. I also loved Washington's farewell address, where he reminds us that the rules that we live by will only work for in America will only work for a moral people. And we look at the challenges in the world today, and you know, America won't work just anywhere, but America works here because of the uniqueness of how we're put together. I think Eisenhower knew that. I think that's implied here in his farewell address, and I could find it and quote it to you, but the paraphrase is that there will always be a new crisis that will want us to move to immediate action.
That's right.
And you know, a thoughtful discussion of the full scope of the consequences of what we choose to do is always the right answer, instead of just acting. It's easy to get carried away with crisis.
Well, as
Mary,
Ike was fond of saying, let's not make our mistakes in a hurry.
Yeah, that's a
Yeah.
good one. I might write that down. Dave, we might want to say that once in a while.
We may
To
still make
me.
mistakes, but let's at least, give it a thoughtful.
That's right, yeah. And again, you know, as we have a couple minutes to wrap up, I never think of Eisenhower's leadership without knowing that this is a man who endured the worst horrors of war. I think of him saying that he was going to go to the death camps to be a witness, because he wanted to be able to say, I saw this with my eyes, not leave it to, Captain or Corporal so-and-so sent me a report, but I saw it. I can be a testimony to the world. Well, President Eisenhower, as a testimony to the world, left us this farewell address.
He did, and again, I think it's indicative of his thinking, how Ike was always thinking of the long game, if you will, and how things would play out down the road. And in fact, Richard Nixon talked about that in the early 60s, that Eisenhower was always thinking 2 or 3 lines of thought or more to every problem and how they might possibly play out in the future. And that's probably why he was also a good poker player and a good card player. But he did have that kind of mind.
When are we going to do that show?
Okay.
Okay,
Anytime.
well, gosh, we're at the end of the program. I knew this one would go to the end. What an exciting opportunity to sit with you and look at your material, but more than that, hear from your years of study of the Eisenhower archives and what is here today. And want to encourage people to come to the library to reinvest their intellect and their time.
To do their own research.
Yeah, do their own research. It's a great opportunity to learn and a great opportunity to grow your community through your personal growth. Tim, so good to see you as always.
Thank you, Dennis.
Great program. Why like Ike? Why not? It's a wonderful guy. It's a wonderful place, and you can come and see it right here in Abilene, Kansas. For the Eisenhower Presidential Library, that's Tim Reeves. I'm Dennis Weiss. I want you to have a great day.